Our second speaker is code 299, answering the question, how will U.S.-Iranian relations change following U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal? Cross-exed by U-136.
In his magnum opus, The Art of the Deal, US President Donald Trump signaled that masterful deal-making is the best way to deal with any situation. But now that he's in the White House, it seems that the president is pursuing a different course, namely the art of leaving a deal. James Hohmann, a writer for The Washington Post and a former US Extemp national champion, pointed out on May 10th of this year that recently the US president failed to renew the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal that was put into place in 2015 under the Obama administration and reduced sanctions towards Iran. In return, Iran pledged to stop nuclearizing towards reaching a nuclear weapon, and in fact, allowed inspectors on a routine basis to check their nuclear facilities to ensure that they were in fact complying. With the United States no longer part of the deal, it seems that the course is in fact changing. And with the event of a nuclear war, in fact being harmful to every single human being on Earth, it's critical that we ask, will President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, how will it impact US relations with Iran? The answer is that it will lead the relationship to deteriorate, as it will embolden Iran's regime. And it will do so in three ways. First, by pushing Iran to nuclearize. Second, by radicalizing the citizens of Iran. And finally, by harming US strategic relationships. Nobody wants a nuclear holocaust. And the first way that we find that President Trump's withdrawal from the US nuclear deal will in fact harm US-Iranian relations is because it will embolden the regime to nuclearize. As The Hill explained in a recent article from May 10th of this year, what we've seen is that the primary goal of Iran's regime is regime survival and the ability to expand its hegemony, both regionally and internationally. In the past, the tool it has used to do so is pushing towards nuclearization, because it knows that that acts as a deterrent and is also able to instill fear in other countries. But it also realizes that soft power, or economic sway, is perhaps an even more important tool for the power of a nation. And that's why it accepted the Iran deal in the first place. But now that the United States has left the deal, it seems that Iran is returning to its previous tactic. As a recent article from the New York Times just last week pointed out, since the US pulled out of the deal, Iran has already moved towards further enrichment of uranium. And while it has yet to actually violate the provisions of the Joint Comprehensive Plans of Action, it sends a signal to the entire world that it is moving towards nuclearization. And that's increasingly worrisome given the makeup of the Trump administration. Because as The Economist explained on May 14th of this year, John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor, and Mike Pompeo have both indicated that if Iran nuclearizes, that the United States should topple their regime. Clearly, because Iran is again moving towards nuclearization, and that will inevitably cause it to butt heads with the US, withdrawal from this deal is definitely not good for the relationship. For the first time since the 1970s, in January, foreign policy experts began to think that Iran's theocracy might be in jeopardy from domestic pressures. But the second reason, why the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will harm US-Iranian relations, is because it will actually radicalize Iran's populace. The Center for Strategic and International Studies explained in a report from January of this year that what we've seen is that Iran, with the Iran deal in place, saw its economy begin to recover. Ultimately, in doing so, it gave the citizens of Iran the tools to protest against their government that they perceive as being oppressive. But according to Abbas Amanat, an expert on Iranian relations and a professor at Yale University, what he indicated in October of last year is that if the United States were to withdraw from the deal, it would send a signal to every single person living in Iran that perhaps the regime is correct, that the United States is the enemy and is to blame for their economic woes. And clearly, that is the case, because as the Rand Corporation explained on May 10th of this year, a new wave of protests recently erupted in Iran. Except this time, they weren't challenging Iran's regime. Instead, they were challenging the United States of America. By Iran being emboldened, no longer under pressure from domestic pressures, it's now able to expand its hegemony even further, ultimately all but ensuring that it will continue to butt heads with the United States, and signaling that leaving this deal was clearly harmful to the relationship. The US and Iran were not the only signatories to the Iran deal. In fact, there were many European nations that were also involved. The final reason why withdrawal from this deal will decidedly harm US and Iran's relationship is because it undermines the strategic interests that the United States has with other European powers. In fact, as The Guardian explained on April 24th of this year, European nations are still very committed to the Iran nuclear deal. It went as far as to explain that Angela Merkel of Germany and Emmanuel Macron of France have indicated that if the US were to leave the deal, ultimately it would signal that the US was no longer a credible ally. And when that comes to applying pressure on Iran, that's very critical. Stratfor Global Intelligence pointed out in January of this year that what we've seen is that the US and Europe's relationship when it comes to Iran is very critical. While the United States has hard power that it is able to apply for pressure towards Iran, it lacks the negotiating skills and credibility with the nation that it needs. On the other hand, while Europe lacks the same hard power as the United States, it does in fact have that same amount of credibility. That's what makes the relationship between the two nations so critical when it comes to Iran. Richard Neustadt, a great American political scientist, pointed out in his book, Presidential Power and the Modern Presidents, that the power of the president is the power to persuade, and at the point that he is no longer maximizing his bargaining chips in order to persuade and enact his agenda, the president has ultimately failed. Clearly, that's what's happening between the United States and Iran. By alienating our European allies, the United States has harmed its ability to persuade Iran to change its ways, by driving a wedge between those key relationships. Nobody wants a nuclear war, and very few people want Iran to have nuclear weapons. That's why we have to ask the question: will President Trump's decision to withdraw the United States from the Iran nuclear deal impact the US and Iran's relationship? It's clear that it definitely will. It will be detrimental to the relationship as it will only embolden Iran. It will do so in three ways. First, by pushing Iran to nuclearize. Second, by radicalizing the populace of Iran. And finally, by undermining the US's key strategic relationships when it comes to applying pressure to Iran. While President Donald Trump has turned away from the art of the deal and is instead deciding to leave the Iran nuclear deal, it's clear that this was not a good decision for the United States or for the world.
Congratulations on a wonderful speech. I just have a few questions. So first, an overarching question. When the United States leaves the Iran deal, does it negate the rest of the countries that signed the Iran deal and their potential to punish Iran?
Yes, I think it does. That's what I signaled in my first point. The reason that Iran signed on to the deal is because it realizes that the United States has the most robust economy in the world. As such, the United States is uniquely able to provide Iran with the economic ties that can bolster its soft power. Now, while other European nations may remain in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the United States' decision to withdraw makes it no longer worthwhile for Iran. And that's why we've already seen, according to the New York Times, that Iran is yet again pushing towards nuclearization.
So let's look to your first point. As you've just admitted, the JCPOA still stands legally. So the frameworks of inspections and investigations into Iran's enrichment of uranium would certainly stop. So doesn't this continued framework at least stop Iran from nuclearization in the immediacy?
I don't think so whatsoever. As you may know, oftentimes international bodies are unable to change the ways of countries. Ultimately, it comes down to Iran's ability to comply. What we've seen is that they no longer have an incentive to comply at the point where the United States is no longer providing them with critical economic ties.
In your second point, considering polls from the Pew Research Center, which still shows that the majority of Iranians have a favorable representation of Americans, doesn't the withdrawal of the deal still not significantly impact the relationship between the Iranian people and the perception of America?
What's important to realize is to step into the shoes of Iran's regime. When they see protests against their regime, it changes their course of action and leads them to not take steps that may further alienate their populace because they fear domestic pressure.
Finally, let's look to your third point when you talk about the US-European relationship. So certainly, Europe's harms affect the strategic capabilities of Iran and their diplomatic power. But how does it directly affect the relationship between the US and Iran, not just their strategic maxims or power?
Right, so this is what I indicated. It will embolden Iran, and thereby that will lead to the deterioration of the relationship. With the US and Europe no longer working together, the persuasion on part of the United States is simply not the same. Iran then feels that it is able to expand its hegemony regionally and again internationally. Ultimately, it will of course butt heads with the United States because of that.
Thank you. Congratulations again.